welfare payments
Thank
that
you,
they
Senator
receive.
Hanson. Your time has expired. Senator Walsh.
Thank you, Deputy President. Well, Labor opposes this bill, and Labor rejects the statements made by Senator Hanson in this chamber today. So many people from around the country have contacted me to let me know that they oppose this bill too. I want dignity and respect, not the cashless debit card. These are the words of Hannah from Nunawading in Victoria. And these words, this sentiment, is repeated time after time in letter after letter and email after email that my office has received on this scheme. People do not want this card. Hannah knows, as do all the people who have contacted my office, that this bill lays the foundation. It lays the foundation for punitive and compulsory income management to be rolled out across the country. This is yet another government policy, another government scheme that proves clearly that this government's policy towards low-income people is to disrespect them, to disempower them, to demonise them. This is the reason why the government are still pursuing the compulsory rollout of this card. First Nations don't want it. Australians don't want it. And every test, every review, every piece of research has told us that this card does not achieve its stated aims. It doesn't work. This bill and this scheme is straight out of the Liberal Party's bottom drawer. It's straight out of their old, tired, nasty playbook. It is designed to drive people down, not to lift them up. And the bill is a stalking horse for a national rollout of the cashless welfare scheme. The bill will make the card permanent in the existing trial sites of Ceduna, the East Kimberley, the Goldfields and Bundaberg-Harvey Bay. In the Northern Territory, it permanently replaces the Basics card with the cashless debit card, and in Cape York it replaces the Basics card with the cashless debit card too. Across these sites, the bill will lead to over 34,700 people on the cashless debit card, permanently, without any choice, compulsory income management. And we also know that government ministers have previously backed a national rollout of this scheme. We know that the government continues to invest in the back-of-house technology that would allow it to conduct that national rollout. And we know that this government has an ideological obsession with income management, regardless of the facts and regardless of the evidence. This bill is a step towards the national rollout that this government so desperately wants, a national rollout that would impact over 1.6 million Australians on unemployment payments, many of whom have just lost their jobs during the COVID-19 pandemic. The government argues that the cashless debit card scheme for social security recipients reduces hardship and deprivation, helps with budgeting strategies and reduces the time recipients spend on welfare and out of the workforce. And they hope to achieve this by forcing recipients to use a cashless card, a card which quarantines 80% of their social security payments. And we know that it isn't working. The cashless debit card and compulsory income management have been the subject of multiple inquiries that this government has chosen to ignore. It's pretty clear that this scheme is causing harm, it's causing hardship, it's making budgeting more difficult, and it's penalising people who are already doing it tough. A recent independent study using data from the Ceduna trial site was the latest to prove just how ineffective this scheme is. They found no impact on the outcomes the government says it is trying to achieve. No impact. In a trial site where this government wants to make the scheme permanent, it was found to have no impact. Dr Luke Greenacre from the University of South Australia and one of the researchers on this study summed up the scheme by saying this: the card offers very little, if no, return on investment, and the cost of implementing and administering the card isn't producing substantial community benefits. Another study from early this year wrote about how this scheme was causing more harm than good, that it was causing feelings of stigma, shame and frustration. amongst participants. Professor Greg Marston from the University of Queensland said that when interviewing participants for the study, and I quote, "They would become visibly upset, recalling incidents where they've been called out for being on the cards and the way in which they hide the cards when they're making transactions in shops." He goes on to say that most participants never had issues with managing their budgets or spending, but that their biggest problem was that they just didn't have enough money for essential items. The study concludes that the case for continuing the scheme is weak. And last year, Dr Elise Klein from the University of Melbourne told a Senate committee, "If we are serious about evidence-based policy making, we must stop the ongoing operations of the cashless debit card or make it entirely voluntary." Again, if we are serious about evidence-based policy making, we must abolish the card or make it entirely voluntary. So it is clear, many years after the first mandatory income management was introduced, 5 years since the cashless debit card was introduced, it does not work. And it is clear that this scheme, is having an overwhelmingly negative impact on people's lives. Emily from Bundaberg is already on the card. She says that hearing that the scheme would become permanent was hard to take. When asked how it made her feel, she said, "I guess hopelessness is the best way to describe it." Hopelessness. And those on social security elsewhere in the country are terrified that the card will be rolled out nationally. Hannah from Nunawading, who I mentioned earlier, says being forced onto the cashless debit card will further disempower me. And Leslie from Katoomba says, "I resent the fact that the government believes that responsible people like myself are unable to manage our own finances. This card takes away our rights, our independence and more." People who have the card don't want it. People who might have to have the card in the future, they don't want it. And we know that all the evidence that has been collected points towards the card not working, not achieving the government's stated aims. But it gets worse, because this scheme and this card are clearly racially discriminatory. Out of the 34,700 people this bill would put on the card permanently with no choice, 68% are First Nations people. And First Nations people's organisations and representatives say the policy is just yet another government imposition. Senator Dodson and Senator McCarthy have spoken in this chamber today and described how this card takes away the autonomy of First Nations people, how it takes away their self-determination. And this is just another policy without adequate consultation imposed on First Nations, without adequate consent from the community. Compulsory income management, it is racially discriminatory. And all Australians want a government that delivers practical solutions for their lives, not tired old ideological positions like this one. But what they have is a government whose only plan for their future is to take away their ability to empower themselves, to make their own decisions, to find their own solutions to the problems that they face. But the government just doesn't seem to care about that, because this bill is just another example of how their approach to low-income Australians is demonisation, because this government thinks that if you fall on hard times, it's your fault. According to Social Services Minister Senator Ruston, in her own words, giving people more money would do absolutely nothing. Probably all it would do is give drug dealers more money and give pubs more money. And according to the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, as we all know, if you have a go, you'll get a go. The harder you work, the better you do. And if you're good at your job, you'll get a job. These are their own words, and we all know what they're really saying. If you're poor, it's your fault. If you fall on hard times, it's your fault. If you're poor, you can't be trusted with your own money. This is the kind of thinking that drives their old, tired, nasty policy positions that are straight out of their playbook. policy positions that have nothing to do with evidence, nothing to do with facts, nothing to do with what is actually proven to work. Policy positions that end up causing pain, despair and disempowerment. The cashless debit card is not the first program to cause this level of hurt to vulnerable and low-income Australians. We have just seen the government forced into repaying over $1 billion to the victims of robo-debt, a scheme that hounded and harassed people, that caused them anxiety and stress, a scheme that derailed lives, a scheme that destroyed lives, a scheme that targeted vulnerable, low-income Australians. Robo-debt was deeply flawed, it was illegal, the government knew it for years, but they insisted that that scheme go on anyway. Based on the evidence and the research, based on the stories and concerns of those on the cashless debit card already, we can see that this scheme is really no different to robo-debt, because the government actually knows that it doesn't work. It knows it has a negative impact on vulnerable Australians, but it's going to push it forward anyway. Why? Because this is a government that goes after poor people. This is a government that hounds poor people. This is a government that harasses them. They attack their dignity. They invade their privacy. This is a government that relentlessly pursues poor people and drives them into the ground. And that tells you everything that you need to know about this government. The cashless debit card takes this approach so far that even some of the government's own MPs have got cold feet about this bill. The member for Bass, Bridget Archer, was damning in her assessment of the scheme. She said the scheme was punitive. She said that there is just not enough evidence that supports this program to justify the associated harm that it causes. And the member for Bass, she summed it up pretty well when she said, whenever you approach a human program by inciting shame and guilt, you have already lost those who you are seeking to help. The member for Monash, Russell Broadbent, also admits concerns about the cashless debit card scheme. So the government are they are not only ignoring the experts on this bill and on this program, they're not just ignoring the communities that this is going to impact so negatively, they're also ignoring now their own backbench. Just like they ignored the warnings about robo-debt, they're ignoring the warnings about the cashless debit card. And this scheme, as we know, is straight from the Liberal Party's bottom drawer, straight from the bottom drawer of their nasty, tired, old, ideologically driven playbook. This is the government's priority right now for this country, this bill. This is the bill the government wants to pass this week. This is the bill that they want to focus on when they should be lifting people up, not driving them into the ground. This is the bill that they want to pass this week when they should be focused on a big, bold, inclusive plan for Australia's recovery, not a plan that is discriminatory, a plan that is inclusive and that lifts everyone up. They should be focused on a plan which empowers people to find work, a plan that creates good, secure jobs, a plan with real heart. That's what Australians are looking for from this government this week, in this last sitting of this parliament. They're looking for a plan with real heart, not a plan that demonises people, not a plan that drives them to absolute despair. Australians are looking to this government for a plan that gives them hope for a better future. And instead, what we have this week, in this last sitting of Parliament for this year, is this bill, which we know is racially discriminatory. They're focused on this bill, a bill which takes away autonomy and choice for First Nations and for all people who are pushed onto this card. They're focused on a bill which has social security recipients around the country alarmed that the card is going to be imposed on them too. This is a bill that lacks basic evidence. It's a bill that lacks support around the country. It's a bill with damaging consequences,
Thank you,
and I urge
Senator
the Senate
Walsh. Your
to
time has
reject it.
expired.